For years, my husband and I were stalked by something. Or rather, he was. I was simply caught in the crossfire, I suppose, and eventually brought it upon myself to act as a sort of guard, keeping constant vigil over him as he slept. I do still, in case it ever returns. The first I'd heard of it was in our college apartment. We were getting ready for class when he told me about a nightmare he'd had the night before. In it, we were lying in bed and something had awoken him. He turned his head to find the silhouette of an enormous man standing in our doorway. The shadow man did not move. It did not pass the border of the door frame. It held no weapon and said nothing. But something about it scared my then fiancé beyond imagination. He stared at the shadow as it simply stood, watching us. And then he awoke, feeling terrified. He said he couldn't explain why this man frightened him so much, only that it did. Being a firm believer in the paranormal, I found this dream unsettling. But after we had gone to class, done some homework, rehearsed for our play, and engaged in our usual nightly ritual of drinking ourselves into an appropriate college couple stupor, the dream remained all but forgotten. It happened gradually, but things began to get weird. Objects began to go missing. Doors we had made sure to close and lock would often be found wide open, and lights we'd sworn we'd turned off would somehow end up turned on. Worried that someone was breaking into our home while we were out, we began making verbal and mental notes of where we placed things, which lights we'd turned off, etc., to make sure we were not simply being forgetful. One night we returned home to find our back porch door wide open and every light in our house on. It wasn't long after that incident that our lease was up and we decided to move. For some months after that, nothing happened. It wasn't until well into our first year of marriage that things began happening again. Once more, objects began to go missing, doors would open and shut inexplicably, and now electronics were beginning to break. One evening, while watching Netflix, our giant 80-plus pound television tipped forward on its own and smashed onto the floor. On several occasions, we would leave the apartment to find that our dog's kennel had been rotated a full 90 degrees with our dog still in it, and began to find children's toys hiding beneath our furniture, although at the time we had no children. Things were always worse when my husband was home alone, however. I remember one incident in particular. While I was working, he called me.
Thank you for calling. This is how may I assist you?
Hey, it's me.
Oh, hey honey, what's up?
When are you coming home?
Well, I'm off at 10, but you know where things are.
Come home now.
Why?
I'm scared.
I rolled my eyes.
Why are you scared?
The light keeps turning off.
So turn on the hall light.
I did. It turned off. And Charlie keeps staring over my shoulder and it's freaking me out.
Well, I don't know what to tell you, honey. I'm stuck here till 10, and I'll be home as soon as I can. If it's a demon, it wants to scare you, so don't let it. Say your prayer, turn on Netflix, ignore everything else till I get home, okay?
Okay.
We said our I love yous and goodbyes, and as soon as I was off work, I headed home. When I got to the apartment, I was surprised to find our home in complete darkness and silence, save for the blue glow emitting from the living room. As I walked in, I found my husband curled beneath a blanket on the couch. Our new projector, which we had replaced the smashed TV with, was on, but the PlayStation was off, and my husband lay stiffly staring at the blue-lit wall. "Honey?" I asked, setting my purse down on the counter. "Why aren't you watching Netflix?"
I was.
His answer was short and tense, and he did not move as he spoke.
It turned off.
"Well, why didn't you turn it back on?"
I did.
He replied curtly, still not moving to look at me.
Twice. It turned off. Can you go check the bathroom because I heard something banging in there and I'm not going in there. I'm done.
On it. Too angry with whatever spirit may have been harassing my husband to be afraid, I threw on the light and marched straight into the bathroom. Immediately I found what he had heard. Face down on the floor, several feet from its hook, was the wooden Precious Moments decoration we'd kept hanging on the wall. I picked it up and walked back to where it had previously hung. The nail was still held firmly in place. I set the wooden plaque back up and wiggled it a little to see if it would fall. It wouldn't. I told him that the plaque had merely fallen off its hook. I didn't want to give whatever had thrown it across the room the satisfaction of frightening him further. It was years before I'd tell him what had really caused the noise in the bathroom. After a year in the apartment, we ended up moving again, and things only continued to get worse. The nightmares of the Shadow Man began leaking into his waking world in the form of sleep paralysis. Night after night, I would awaken to hear him trying desperately to scream, barely able to manage a tiny moan. His mouth slackened, eyes opened, staring at something terrifying that I could not see. He was unable to move or speak, and the Shadow Man would come. Sometimes it would simply stand by the door, staring as it had before. Other times it would come closer, bringing with it a noise which would rattle my husband's ears. Other times it would alter my appearance as I attempted to wake him, twisting my face into something from hell in his eyes. I began waking several times a night, torn from my sleep by the tiniest noise to make sure he was not in the grips of another episode. I also took to covering his eyes before moving into his view to keep him from seeing anything more. Every time I would break him from the Shadow Man's grasp, I would hear him whimper a breathless "thank you" before closing his eyes and trying to fall back to sleep. It wasn't long after the birth of our first child that our spectral stalker began taunting me. I began having nightmares of demons shrieking in laughter as it clawed its way through our bedroom door, mocking me as I desperately tried to shove it back out. Even when my husband was away at work, I'd hear knocking on the walls of my bedroom, always rhythmic, 3 at a time, first at one wall, then another. I began sleeping with my father's Bible beside my bed, just in case the Shadow Man ever decided to come too close. A few times, as I sat rocking my son, he would look over my shoulder and suddenly began to scream in fear, and on more than one occasion I would see what looked like hunch-over shadows sprint through the room, my dog's eyes also following it as it passed. My son began having night terrors, and I began to hear indistinguishable whispers from behind the walls, all the while my husband's episodes becoming more and more frequent. Our fears that this entity was nothing short of demonic seemed to be confirmed after one particularly horrifying dream. A voice, an unearthly voice, which was terrible and beautiful and horrible all in one. It was a voice which to this day he cannot fully describe. It spoke only one word, a name which he'd never heard before in his life. Belial. He told me the moment he'd awoken about the voice and the name and asked if I knew anyone by that name. I grew up in the church and spent all my grade school years in a Christian academy, so I had of course heard that name before. Belial is a demon, and a nasty one at that. I told him this, and asked if he was trying to frighten me. But before I had even finished my sentence, the colour had drained from his face, and he looked on the verge of tears. He put his face in his hands and whimpered.
I knew it.
Less than a week later, as we were getting out of bed, I noticed in the middle of his forehead what looked like a fingernail scratch in the shape of an upside-down cross. When I saw it, I rolled my eyes and laughed, asking what he'd done to his face. I was certain he was trying to scare me, and this seemed a little too cliché.
What are you talking about?
He asked. If he was messing with me, he was doing an unusually good job of it. The cross on your head? I said, pointing to the mark and looking at him in complete disbelief. He reached up to his forehead.
I don't have a cross on my face. You're fucking with me.
Yeah, you do, I insisted, my laughter fading into something a little more uncomfortable. You scratched an upside-down cross on your face, and you better hope it fades before church, 'cause it's really not funny. My husband eyed me suspiciously and once more accused me of trying to frighten him, claiming that the second he'd look in the mirror, I'd burst into laughter with a mockish, "made you look." Feeling more and more uneasy by the second, I assured him that if anyone was playing tricks, it was him. Immediately he leapt up and ran to the bathroom. When he came back out, he was pale and looked as if he was going to be sick.
Please tell me you did this.
His voice was quaking as he pointed to the mark. Genuinely afraid now, I answered. No, you did. You didn't?
No, I didn't fucking do it.
He yelled, his breath quickened as he began to panic. It took a while to talk him down. I began to look for anything to make him feel better. I told him that it was probably just a coincidence that it looked like an upside-down cross. Perhaps his face simply itched last night and he scratched it too hard in 2 directions. See, you're in church now and you didn't burst into flames. That's a good sign. No matter what I told him the rest of the day, he was dreading falling asleep again that night. It wasn't until a friend at work suggested that since it was my family that was being stopped, perhaps it was my family that should be blessed. It wasn't long after that my son had choked on his milk and stopped breathing twice, leading us to a 2-day visit to the hospital. While there, a priest happened by our room. He asked if there was anything we needed, and at first I declined. But then her words echoed in the back of my mind, and I called him back in. It was a long shot, I knew, but I asked him if he could bless our family anyway. It was so simple. He said a prayer, blessed our family, and went on his way. Nothing dramatic happened. My husband didn't writhe in agony and speak in tongues, the lights didn't flicker, and no one's head spun round. So simple. I didn't think anything would come of it, but then... nothing. Really, nothing. Nights passed, then months, then years. And nothing. No sign of the Shadow Man. No more knocking, no more voices. Nothing. We relaxed, and no longer felt the need to sleep on pins and needles, guarding my family from spiritual attacks. Or at least, not for a long time. Some months ago, it happened again. Not quite to the extent that it had before. But in my sleep, I heard and was awoken by a familiar sound. I rolled over to see my husband, slack-jawed, eyes wide, trying desperately to cry out for me to help him. I covered his eyes and rolled him onto his side, breaking him from his paralysis. I asked him if he saw the Shadow Man. He said no, but he could hear it coming, like it wanted him to know that it was coming back. For the next week or so, I slept on edge, listening for my husband's voice, but it never came. The last time we encountered it was the most terrifying one of all. My husband was sick and could barely walk. He had been in bed all day, and that night I was awoken by the bed shaking. I sat up and watched as he walked quickly to the bedroom door, opened it, walked straight back to the bed and fell face first, back down. There was something so frightening in this action. First of all, the man, who is almost 7 feet tall, by the way, had been unable to carry himself to the bathroom all day long, let alone walk at that pace. Secondly, as he fell back into the bed, he kept his arms at his side and didn't even bother to turn his face as it hit the pillow. In the darkness beyond our door, I felt something wrong. I touched his back. "Honey?" I asked, trying to remain rational. He didn't move. "Honey?" I tried shaking him a little. "What are you doing?"
I'm asleep.
His voice was toneless and muffled beneath his pillow. "Honey, why did you open the door?"
I had to.
The hairs on my arm began to raise as a feeling of ice ran down my spine. "Honey, why did you have to open the door?"
I had to.
He repeated in the same dead voice as before. "Why?" No answer. "Honey, why did you have to open the door?" There was a pause before he answered.
I was threatened.
I honestly thought I was going to be sick at this point. "Who threatened you?" I demanded. "Honey? Who threatened you?" His whole body tensed up and he began screaming and weeping into his pillow. Terrified, I leapt up and sprinted to the door, slamming it shut as quickly as I could. "No! No!" I screamed, running back to the bed and grabbing my husband by the shoulder. "Get out! Get out! In the name of God, get out! God, make it stop! Make it go away!" At this point, my 3-month-old daughter had begun to cry, and I scooped her into my arms, continuing to pray. A few moments later, my husband went limp and quiet. I stared at him in horror as I cradled my infant in my arms, waiting to see what he'd do next. Suddenly, he stirred and turned around.
I'm sorry, honey, I didn't hear her crying.
He said groggily, as if he'd just woken from a perfectly pleasant dream. What was that? I demanded, holding our child close to my chest.
What do you mean? You woke me up because she was crying.
To be honest, at that point I thought I was going to lose it. I told him what had happened and watched as the colour drained from his face. He didn't remember any of it. And the thought that he'd opened the door when he was physically unable to walk, he was just as unsettled as I was. Afraid of what he might do after falling back to sleep, I picked up the phone and called into work. I knew they wouldn't understand, but to be honest, I didn't care. My children were at home. If something had indeed taken over my husband's body in his weakened state, I couldn't leave them alone. It has been a while since anything has happened since then. My husband has begun to lose all memory of our experiences with the Shadow Man. One by one, they begin to fade from his mind completely. Once again, we have moved, and once again, we find ourselves at a moment of peace. But still, I find myself awaking in the middle of the night, rolling over to see if my husband is still safely asleep, keeping guard in case Belial, or whatever it was, decides to return.